It had been a promising day. They were the army of Bagan, the golden empire that was founded 2 centuries ago. Burmese nobles and knights rode on their war elephants, all gilded and armored. Columns of hardened infantry marched behind them, armed with swords, spears, and shields. The enemy before them was shaking, their horses skittish, and fear clear in their eyes. In a single battle cry, the Burmese charged. In the 1270s, relations between the Mongol Yuan Dynasty in China and the Tibeto-Burmans of Bagan in Burma broke down when King Narathihabadi refused Kublai Khan's demand for tribute and submission. As the Mongol armies were busy fighting on other fronts, the Burmese took the chance to take parts of the disputed territories. The Burmese army arrived on April 1277, and the Mongol garrison rode out to meet them in an area known in Burmese as Ngasaunggyan. The first battle in Ngasaunggyan is widely considered to be the first time tales of Burma reached Europe through Marco Polo, who had pieced it together from various accounts in Kublai Khan's court. There is no Burmese version of the account, except for the final result of the battle in a stone inscription. Thus, for this reconstruction, we will have to make quite a few estimates for the battle. Depending on the source, the Mongol army was recorded to have been somewhere as low as 700 to as many as 12,000 strong. Marco Polo wrote that the Mongol army was under the command of General Nasir ad-Din, son of Yunnan's governor, a Central Asian Muslim named Sayyid ad-Din. But Yuan records state that it is under the command of a minor Mongol commander named Kutuk. Polo was probably mistaken, as Nasir ad-Din took part in the war against Burma later. The Yuan force was centered around a smaller core force of Mongol Turkish cavalrymen supported by local borderland infantry armed with spears and bows. For this reconstruction, we will keep the numbers from Marco Polo's account, where the Mongol army was around 10 to 12,000 men, consisting of 700 elite Mongol troops supported by a much larger force of Central Asian and Chinese. The force will be commanded by the Mongol Kutuk instead of Nasir ad-Din. According to Polo and the Yuan sources, King Narathihabadi of Bagan was personally leading the army, consisting of around 60,000 men and over 2,000 elephants. This figure is unlikely, as Bagan lacked the resources and manpower to even field half of such a force. Bagan's forces had been stretched thin, with rebellions flaring very often in the kingdom, thanks to King Narathihabadi alienating his subjects. British historian Harvey suggested that the Yuan records exaggerated the Burmese numbers so as to promote the supremacy that Kublai Khan desired. There is also no mention of King Narathihabadi's presence in the battle from the Burmese side. The traditional and popular Burmese view of King Narathihabadi was that of a weak coward. Instead, according to Utanton, the Burmese army was led by Ananda Pyasi, who was the commander-in-chief and prime minister. However, the king could have still potentially rode with the army as a nominal commander. For this reconstruction, we will keep Narathihabadi's presence, but only as a nominal figurehead, as the Burmese view would have been, with his generals doing the actual commanding and fighting. The Burmese army would have likely outnumbered the Mongols, but not to the extent of 60,000 strong men and 2,000 elephants. Instead, the Burmese would have likely outnumbered the Mongols by at the very least 2 to 1, and had at most 80 war elephants. Although Southeast Asian armies often had a large number of elephants accompanying them, most of these elephants were generally used for labor and non-combat roles. Fighting elephants were never in great numbers due to the time and expenses they take to train. These elephants were reserved for the Burmese royalty and noble elite, with the remaining knightly class of Mynsi fighting on horseback. The vast majority of the Burmese army would have been lightly armed peasant levies, making up perhaps 70% of the force. Although Burmese literature mentioned the use of armor, there is no archaeological evidence of them. The nobility and the knights would have likely worn possibly some form of mail armor that was common in the region, but the peasant levies would have been completely unarmored. As for the Mongols, Marco Polo mentioned that the Yuan had heavy cavalry wearing thick laminar armor, as well as lightly armored archers, both mounted and on foot. The Mongols would have been quite worried to face the Burmese with such limited forces, but Kutuk had chosen the site of battle well. Picking a level playing field with thick trees on his flank and rear, Kutuk kept the Burmese from surrounding him. The Yuan followed the steep military tradition, consisting of 3 major divisions, a center, and 2 wings. Marco Polo wrote that the Yuan commander had rallied his seemingly outnumbered men through a short speech, and calling to him all his horsemen that they would not be of less might than they had been in the past, and that the strength did not consist in numbers but in the valor of the brave and tried horsemen, and that the people of Mien, the Burmese, were inexperienced and not practiced in war, in which they had not been engaged as they, the Mongols themselves, had been so many times, and therefore they must not fear the multitude of the enemy but trust in their own skill, which had already been long tried in many places in so many enterprises that their name was feared and dreaded, not only by the enemy but by all the world. So they must be of that same valor as they had been, and he promised them certain and undoubted victory. The battle began with the Burmese making the first move. Covered in gilded armor and towers on top of them, the Burmese war elephants led the advance, followed by their cavalry. A common tactic in Southeast Asia was to use the elephants to charge and break the enemy formation. Horse cavalry would then follow, exploiting the gaps made by the elephants, and spread the havoc. Infantry would then follow up and mop up the remaining enemy forces. As the Mongols came into view, as one, the Burmese elephants trumpeted and charged. When the elephants neared, the Yuan forces tried to stand their ground, but the Turkish and Mongol horses were frightened by the great creatures. With their elite riders wavering and seeing how badly outnumbered they were, the rest of the Yuan forces also began to falter. Kutuk, realizing that his entire force could potentially fall apart before the battle could even begin, ordered his forces to retreat into the trees, hoping to re-establish discipline among his men. He ordered his cavalry to dismount, tying the horses' rein to the trees, and returned to the plains on foot with his infantry. There, the Yuan did what the English would do 70 years later in France, blocking the sun with their arrows. Mongol bowmen and their local allies launched arrow after arrow at the large Burmese war elephants. The Burmese archers on top of their elephants shot back, but clumped up as they were in their towers and seats, they could not hope to compete against the more powerful Mongol composite bows. Most of the Mongol arrows, however, could not penetrate the elephant's armor and natural thick hide. And yet, the concentrated barrage of arrows constantly raining on the great creatures were beginning to panic them. Burmese riders began to struggle with their elephants' uneasiness. Normally, elephant units in Southeast Asian armies were supported by infantrymen who would use their shields to protect their elephants from arrow fire. But according to Polo, the Burmese elephants seemed to have been isolated. Either the elephants outpaced their infantry support, or the Burmese, possibly under the incompetent orders of King Narati Hapedit, had sent their elephants in alone, hoping for a quick victory. Regardless, the elephants panicked and broke ranks, and the entire Burmese elephant corps shattered. Many other rampaging elephants pushed into their own lines, breaking the Burmese cavalry behind them and scattering their own infantry. Suddenly presented with a golden opportunity, Kutuk began the process to remount his army. Mongol archers continued to rain the arrows down on the Burmese and kept the chaos, while Kutuk took the rest of the Mongol force to mount up. The archers then slowly fell back to mount up again, until the entire Yuan cavalry was horseback once more. Kutuk then launched a general attack led by his cavalry, just as the Burmese began to reform. The details at this point are unclear, while all agree that the fighting was fierce and would last nearly the entire day. From Marco Polo, we could infer some idea of how the fighting went. According to Polo, the Burmese were frustrated by the Mongol archery and their superior armor. The Burmese, with their superior numbers, tried to overrun the Yuan, but the Mongols used their armored cavalry to hold the tide by charging and retreating the Burmese infantry blocks repeatedly, while their archers showered their arrows into the mass of foot soldiers. The unarmored Burmese infantry was badly mauled and were unable to break or chase down the heavier armored Mongol horsemen, and were slowly being worn down by arrow fire. The Burmese were no slouch in combat, however, and with each contact more and more Mongol riders were unhorsed and then torn apart by the Burmese blades. By noon, the Bagan army began to crack from repeated charges and arrow fire. A final charge by Kutuk and his armored lancers broke through the Bagan lines and forced the Burmese to make a general retreat. Like most pitched battles, the majority of the Burmese casualties fell during this retreat, cut down by Mongol riders. Despite being vastly outnumbered and nearly broken earlier, the Mongols held the day and inflicted one of the worst Burmese defeats in history. They did not escape unscathed, however. Marco Polo mentioned that the Mongol losses were rather heavy. Their quick-witted commander, Kutuk, who had been responsible for turning the situation to Mongol favor, was badly wounded. As a result, the Yuan were in no shape to pursue the Burmese army and had to withdraw back to Yunnan proper. The battle severely damaged the Bagan dynasty's reputation. Unrest and rebellion in the empire increased. Rival princes rose to challenge the throne, while many vassal states, particularly the Mon and Rakhine cities, were beginning to formally declare independence, and with a large part of the military destroyed, the Bagan throne had little to respond to these crises. But worst of all, the Battle of Ngasaunggyan had brought the declining Burmese kingdom to the attention of Kublai Khan, who sought to redeem his prestige from the failure of his Japanese and Vietnamese campaigns. Join us next time as Kublai Khan personally turned his attention to Bagan and the Mongol invasion of Burma began in earnest. If you like content like this, support my channel by hitting the subscribe button. Only with support from you guys I'm able to continue making content like this. See you around.